8th episode of Toke TV, where we bring you the biggest cannabis and hemp news stories of the week. I'm Steve Elliott, your host. I'm editor of TokeSignals.com, and I'll be bringing you the news. First of all, let's have a little fun and appreciate a little beauty by looking at our bud pick of the week. We all like the pretty flowers, and here we have some Jack Herer flowers. This is a sativa strain, a very tasty, fruity sativa strain. I found this at the CPC, an access point in South Seattle, the neighborhood of Georgetown. And the donation there is $12 a gram for the Jack Herer. It is very worthwhile smoke. It is good working medicine for during the day. As a sativa, it has a lot of energy to it. I was assisted in making the selection by the very able bud tender there at the CPC, Lydia Inslee. They are lucky to have such a knowledgeable bud tender on staff. Lydia also helped me select our good medicine of the week, which is this Vortex BHO Shatter. This is a sativa variety, Vortex is, from which this butane hash oil concentrate is made. As you can see, it is quite something. It costs $30 per half a gram, and let me tell you, it is almost instantaneous relief from nausea and pain. You can do this on a nail as far as doing the BHO, or you can do it in a vape pen. You can also eat BHO. A lot of people don't know that. So there are several different ways you can do this. If you do it on a nail, you might want to be careful about the size of your hits because it is an expectorant. It does have a lot of expansion in your chest, so be careful with that. And you may want to try it. It's a little bit easier to inhale on a vape pen. This is the voice of experience speaking here. Okay, let's get into the news now. First of all, this week we had a big story in that it was the first hearing on marijuana legalization ever held in the U.S. Congress. The reason for the hearing was the Senate Judiciary Committee held a hearing on the conflicts between state and federal marijuana laws. First time they've ever done this. And the move comes shortly after the Department of Justice announced back on August 29th that it will not sue to stop Colorado and Washington from implementing their marijuana legalization laws. Coming as it does shortly after the DOJ announcement, advocates are hoping that this signals a shift in Obama administration policy towards more sensible drug enforcement, although federal laws, for now, still remain unchanged. This hearing reinforced the growing consensus among legal marijuana regulators, law enforcement, and cannabis business professionals that allowing access to banking services is now the most pressing obstacle to the success of the regulated marijuana industry, realizing its potential to effectively control cannabis sales in the states where it is legal for medical or adult use, and ensuring that the 8 federal enforcement policies outlined in last month's Department of Justice memo can be upheld, according to the National Cannabis Industry Association. The hearing included Deputy Attorney General James Cole, Sheriff John Urquhart of King County, Washington, and Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper's Chief Legal Counsel Jack Finlaw, among others. Deputy Attorney General Cole didn't challenge states' rights to make their own marijuana laws. That could be a crucial point in the future. Cole only restated the federal government's right to challenge state regulatory schemes and pursuing certain priorities, such as preventing sales to minors, trafficking to other states, and empowerment of criminals and drug cartels. Cole acknowledged that in states where marijuana has been decriminalized or legalized, implementing a strictly regulated system in which marijuana is sold is the only way to prevent criminal activity, such as diversion to youth and sales across state lines. Senators Patrick Leahy of Vermont, Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, and Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, all 3 Democrats, and both representatives from the states of Washington and Colorado who were on hand, firmly and repeatedly stated the need for greater clarification of federal marijuana policy, particularly as this relates to guidelines which prohibit financial institutions, security services, landlords, and others from doing business with marijuana providers. We need to address the banking situation, and we are working on it, Cole said, indicating that the Department of Justice is conferring with the Department of Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Division to resolve this issue. Cole said that they're working on establishing regulations for financial institutions. He said that landlords will be protected who rent to marijuana dispensaries. And he said that the DEA had merely asked questions of armored car and other security services and had not, as was reported recently, issued an injunction forbidding armored car companies from working with marijuana dispensaries. Senator Whitehouse also brought up the federal government's conflicting instructions on marijuana enforcement in the past, but Deputy Attorney General Cole merely affirmed the government's right to intervene on a case-by-case basis. Both Urquhart and Finlaw from Washington and Colorado were fully supportive of their state's new laws and repeatedly affirmed their belief that sensible regulations, such as restrictions on advertising, regulation of place and manner of marijuana sales, security requirements, laws against vertical integration, so forth, would ensure that they complied with the federal government's areas of concern. It's about time our federal lawmakers took up this issue, said Tom Angel of Marijuana Majority. Polls show that the majority of voters support legalizing and regulating marijuana, but far too many elected officials continue to act like this issue is still some dangerous third rail of politics that's too dangerous to touch. This is a serious, important, and mainstream issue, and it's good to see politicians finally treating it as such, Angel said. As senators made clear today with important questions about legal marijuana providers' access to banking, armored car services, and tax write-offs that are available to any other business, the Obama administration's recent memo to prosecutors is a good first step, but it will not remove all of the roadblocks that stand in the way of effective implementation of state marijuana laws. The next step, according to Angel, is for Congress to amend the Controlled Substances Act to make it clear that America is moving in a new direction when it comes to marijuana policy. As Senator Sheldon Whitehouse pointed out, the Obama administration has repeatedly shifted its marijuana policy since 2009, when it released a memo saying that medical marijuana providers operating in clear and unambiguous compliance with state law would not be a focus for federal enforcement, according to Angel. Since that time, though, President Obama has overseen the closure of more state legal marijuana businesses in one term than were shut down during 2 terms of the Bush administration. According to Angel, it remains to be seen whether prosecutors will follow through this time and finally help the president uphold his campaign pledge to respect state marijuana laws. One thing the president could do right now, according to Angel, to signal that he's serious about this most recently announced policy shift would be to use his commutation powers to release some of the medical marijuana prisoners that have been put behind bars by Obama's federal agencies. Dan Riffle, Director of Federal Policies for the Marijuana Policy Project, applauded Senator Leahy and the committee for initiating what he called a much-needed dialogue about our nation's failed marijuana prohibition laws. Riffle said, "We hope this discussion will inspire Congress to take action and make the Department of Justice policy the law of the land. Marijuana is an objectively less harmful substance than alcohol, and most Americans do not believe adults should be punished for using it," Riffle said. Voters and state legislators are poised to approve laws similar to those adopted in Colorado and Washington. The administration is doing its best to work around federal law, but a better approach would be to simply fix federal law and permanently resolve this conflict. Representatives from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, LEAP, a group of law enforcement officials opposed to the war on drugs, watched the hearing with interest. For years, the legalization movement has been gaining traction as people learn this is neither a fringe issue nor a partisan issue, but one responsible for deep inequities in our justice system, the expansion of criminal gangs, and the increase in unsolved violent crimes, said LEAP board member and 36-year Denver cop Tony Ryan. There's a long road ahead, and this hearing leaves many questions unanswered. But this historic discussion means we are on our way to a more rational and effective drug policy, Ryan said. While I would have liked to have seen a substantive change in policy, what we are really listening to in that hearing was the sound of a changing political climate, said retired Seattle Police Chief and LEAP Speaker Norm Stamper. People who can't agree on any other political issue are coming together over this one. And politicians on both sides of the aisle ignore that at their own peril, Stamper said. According to Aaron Smith, Executive Director of the National Cannabis Industry Association, the Department of Justice is finally taking seriously the dangers that a lack of access to simple banking poses to consumers, employees, and business owners. We are encouraged that the growing consensus among essentially all stakeholders is that banking access must be available to legal businesses, Smith said. It portends a quick reform to this dangerous and unnecessary situation. Ethan Nadelman, Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance, said it feels like there's a paradigm shift underway in the Justice Department's interpretation of federal drug control law. They seem to recognize that drug control should be first and foremost about protecting public health and safety, Nadelman said, and that smart statewide regulatory systems of the sort that Colorado and Washington are proposing may advance those objectives better than knee-jerk enforcement of federal prohibitions. King County, Washington Sheriff John Urquhart called the war on drugs a failure at Tuesday's hearing. The reality is we do have complementary goals and values, the sheriff said. I am simply asking that the federal government allow banks to work with legitimate marijuana businesses who are licensed under this new state law. And speaking of the tax scheme and how it unfairly affects marijuana dispensaries, we had an unlikely political alliance this week call upon the federal government to change its tax rules to stop unfairly targeting marijuana dispensaries. Grover Norquist of the conservative group Americans for Tax Reform, the ATR, and liberal Congressman Earl Blumenauer of Oregon identified the unjust application of federal tax code for legal marijuana businesses at a press conference with the National Cannabis Industry Association this week. Representative Blumenauer, a Democrat from Oregon, and ATR President Grover Norquist, along with the National Cannabis Industry Association's Executive Director Aaron Smith, held a press conference on Thursday to mark the release of a new white paper from ATR entitled Legal Cannabis Dispensary Taxation, a textbook case of punishing law-abiding businesses through the tax code. This paper calls for reform of Internal Revenue Code Section 280E, which essentially forces medical marijuana providers to pay taxes based on gross receipts rather than income, unlike all other small businesses. Additionally, the paper details Americans for Tax Reform's endorsement of H.R. 2240, the Small Business Tax Equity Act, introduced earlier this year by Representative Blumenauer and strongly supported by the NCIA. Norquist also sent a letter explaining his support for H.R. 2240 to House Ways and Means Chairman Dave Count. Congress needs to take swift action to amend 280E, a leftover relic in the tax code that was never intended to apply to small businesses complying with state laws, said Aaron Smith of the National Cannabis Industry Association. Without the technical amendment needed to allow these businesses to be treated equally under tax law, states and municipalities that are currently embracing the emerging regulated cannabis industry will never be able to realize its full economic potential, according to Smith. Representative Blumenauer said that small legal marijuana businesses are being victimized by the federal tax code. They cannot deduct their business expenses like all other businesses, he said. They cannot claim advantages like the Work Opportunity Tax Credit if they hire a veteran. They cannot depreciate their American-made irrigation equipment. This is why I introduced the Small Business Tax Equity Act, Representative Blumenauer explained. Only Congress can fix this problem by updating the federal tax law that forces these businesses to close their doors or drives them underground, encouraging evasion. I welcome Americans for Tax Reform in endorsing this legislation. A common sense fix with appeal across the political spectrum. Speaking of policies changing, this time on a perhaps less crucial and more entertainment-oriented level, the National Football League is under pressure now to ease its harsh penalties for marijuana use. The NFL has just fallen behind the times, frankly, when it comes to acceptance of marijuana. So far, they've stubbornly refused to follow the lead of the American public's shifting opinion about recreational cannabis use. Now, the Marijuana Policy Project has highlighted this discrepancy when it paid $5,000 for a 48-foot billboard in Denver prior to the Broncos' season opener against the defending Super Bowl champion Baltimore Ravens. This billboard urged the league to stop driving players to drink, quote unquote, with harsh marijuana penalties, noting a safer choice is now legal here in Colorado after voters in November approved legalization measure Amendment 64. The MPP has also launched a petition on change.org directed at NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell, calling on the league to change its harsh penalties for marijuana. For years, the NFL has been punishing players for using marijuana despite the fact that it is far less harmful than alcohol, a substance widely embraced by the league, said Mason DeVert, Director of Communications at the Marijuana Policy Project. The league would never punish a player simply for having a couple of beers, so why does it penalize them for using a substance that is less toxic, less addictive, and less likely to contribute to violence? DeVert asked. The NFL's harsh marijuana penalties do nothing to promote the health and safety of the players. We hope Commissioner Goodell will explain why the NFL is willing to promote the use of alcohol among its players and fans, but unwilling to recognize that a safer alternative is now legal here. NFL officials wouldn't comment on the billboard, unsurprisingly. It'll stay up at least through September 22nd. If officials commented, DeVert's statements and any league policy changes would have to be negotiated with the players' union. We're seeing this shift that even the federal government is now recognizing, DeVert said. So why does the NFL feel it has to be in the business of policing marijuana beyond the legal penalties already in place? The most severe NFL penalty for marijuana was meted out in 2006 when star running back Ricky Williams was suspended for 18 months as a repeat cannabis offender. More recently, All-Pro linebacker Von Miller of the Broncos was suspended for the first 6 games of this season. Rumor has it he was being punished for pot use. But the writing's on the wall, according to Mason DeVert. Most of the nation supports the recreational use of marijuana by adults. And in this nation, our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., is looking at legalizing marijuana. A marijuana legalization bill is to be introduced in the D.C. Council next week. If we're going to have alcohol legal in this country, I don't see any reason why we couldn't have marijuana legal, said D.C. Councilman David Grosso. The bill would regulate and tax marijuana sales and create licensing requirements for the Alcoholic Beverage Regulation Administration, and it would reportedly make it legal for cannabis users to grow a small amount on their own property. Grosso thinks a few attempts might be necessary to get the legislation passed. He says he's not holding his breath this year, but he's hoping to get the debate started. Now, 10 of the district's 13 council members already support a bill to decriminalize possession of small amounts of pot, but that doesn't necessarily mean they support full legalization. I totally agree that small amounts of marijuana should not put someone through the criminal justice system, said Council Member Mary Che, a Ward 3 Democrat. I don't know that I'm willing to go all the way toward legalization. And D.C. Council Member Tommy Wells said he supports the decrim bill, but he said legalization is fundamentally different. The motivation for decriminalization has simply been the issue of the war on drugs and the disproportionate impact on African American youth getting criminal records, Wells said. Black people are 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession than whites, with comparable rates of usage between the two groups, according to an ACLU report released in June. The decrim bill supported by Wells, which is before the council, would make possession of an ounce or less of marijuana a civil violation punishable by a $100 fine. The cops would seize the pot. D.C. is one of the worst offenders in busting African Americans more often than white people for marijuana, according to Morgan Fox, communications manager at the Marijuana Policy Project. We need to start concentrating on actual violent crimes, Fox said. By arresting people for something that is safer than alcohol, you are slapping them with a criminal record, which is related to cycles of poverty. The fact that Congress has federal oversight of D.C.'s ordinances could mean a reversal of any legalization law there. There is no question that that is where things are going eventually. The question is timing, said Dan Riffle of the MPP regarding legalization. The fact that it's under Congress's jurisdiction might incline us to wait a little bit longer than we would otherwise. Hoping to let voters decide the matter rather than the D.C. Council, one activist, Adam Eidinger, plans to submit an initiative this week to the D.C. Board of Elections that would put marijuana legalization on the 2014 ballot and in front of the voters. Eidinger last week withdrew a previously submitted initiative that would have decriminalized small amounts of pot, pledging to pursue full legalization instead. I think a ballot initiative would make it harder for Congress to interfere without a political cost, Eidinger said. Smart politicians will adjust their position on this and will be more willing to explore this. And switching over to the West Coast, where we have a legalization law of sorts, here in Washington, we have some unwelcome fallout from the passage of I-502. We have now a legislator in Washington, a former narcotics cop, Christopher Hurst, who wants to shut down the medical marijuana system in Washington state, as approved and legalized by voters 15 years ago in 1998. Under Washington state's new recreational marijuana legalization law, I-502, recreational marijuana will be heavily taxed and heavily controlled by the Washington State Liquor Control Board. The parallel world of medical marijuana is relatively unregulated in comparison, although state voters legalized it back in 1998. But in the opinion of Representative Hurst, a Democratic legislator and retired police commander who once, as I mentioned, served on a narcotics task force, that means medical marijuana should be shut down. Tight regulations for recreational marijuana are being written as we speak, and state regulators are crafting those rules, just as many in the medical marijuana community predicted last year. They are itching to control the medical marijuana sector as well. So, could it really be that medical marijuana gadflies like Steve Sarich were right all along, that the tepid form of legalization, quote unquote, achieved by I-502 with no home growing allowed and with only up to 1 ounce legalized will cost patients their safe access to medicinal strains? Could 502 supporters, such as New Approach Washington's Allison Holcomb, Washington Normal's Keith Henson, and Canadian pot prince's Jody Emery, really have been that clueless or cavalier about the fallout from I-502? Part of the fervor with which Liquor Control Board regulators and legislators like Hurst have around forcing the medical marijuana community to abide by the rules established for recreational users, under a law, mind you, which was presented to voters as having no effect on medical marijuana patients or safe access for them, seems to have everything to do with shutting down the competition. At a Tuesday work session of the House Government Accountability and Oversight Committee to update legislators on I-502 implementation and recommended regulations for the medical marijuana market, Representative Hurst offered what he called a pointed observation. Referring to U.S. Attorney of Western Washington Jenny Durkin's recent remark that the medical marijuana market was untenable, Hurst said, "I think there isn't an iota of difference between untenable and illegal. I think that if you are selling marijuana today, it is just plain illegal," Hurst claimed. "It doesn't look like the dispensaries that we have operating are even on the periphery of something that is legitimate." Hurst wasn't done. He went on to admit that part of his reasoning lies in the competition that the medical marijuana dispensaries represent for the state licensed recreational pot stores. We have to really take a hard look and say, do we really want to be competing with an enterprise that is 99 and 9/10%, maybe not 9/10, but 99.2%, just a criminal enterprise? Hurst said. So just like that, former narcotics cop, Representative Chris Hurst, gets to designate an entire industry, an industry which has for years brought safe access to many suffering patients in Washington, as a criminal enterprise. This guy is gunning for medical marijuana, said Hillary Bricken, a Seattle attorney for marijuana entrepreneurs, at a HempFest panel last month. As shown by her testimony on Tuesday, she got it right. To hear the chair refer to medical marijuana as the state's competition again and again, and that it needs to go away or cease to exist, is incredible, said proprietor Deidre Finley of the MMJ Universe Medical Marijuana Farmers Market near Black Diamond, Washington. I wish they could see for themselves the patients that come into the market seeking relief from any number of debilitating diseases, and that they could hear their amazing stories, Deidre told me. Finley is assembling a video of medical marijuana patient testimonials, and she invites all Washington patients who visit MMJ Universe to participate. Please put your name on a list that will be at the front counter if you're interested in sharing your story about how medical marijuana has helped you, she said. You can be anonymous if you wish, but your lawmakers are certain that 99.2% of us are frauds. They need to hear your stories. Now is the time, friends, Finley said. Speak up or lose your access to high-quality meds. The I-502 weed will not be anything like the medicine that you currently have access to. Representative Hurst grudgingly threw patients a tiny bone at Tuesday's hearing, granting not to say there is not a legitimate use for medical marijuana, but this former narcotics cop appears unwavering in his determination to shut the whole medical marijuana thing down. Washington patients stand to lose not only safe access through dispensaries, but also the ability to grow up to 15 plants. Again, no home cultivation is allowed under I-502, and to lose their legal right to possess up to 24 ounces. Only 1 ounce is allowed under 502. Clearly, the recreational rules weren't written with patients in mind. The Washington legislature is expected to take up the issue of Liquor Control Board regulation of medical marijuana at its next session. Liquor Control Board Executive Rick Garza told Tuesday's legislative work session that his agency's recommendations are scheduled to come out in late November, roughly the same time the board is supposed to start taking license applications for the recreational marijuana market. In California, on Friday, we have the LA Weekly's website claiming marijuana can kill your dog. Let me hasten to say it's not true, so there's no need to panic. You can always count on some clueless mainstream reporter on a regular basis claiming that marijuana can hurt your pets or is bad for Fido. It's just not true. Cannabis is non-toxic to all mammals. The end. But when a reporter covering the weed beat for an alternative weekly, that is a guy who should know way better, claims that pot can kill your pooch, it's time for a public correction. That's just what Fact Challenge reporter Dennis Romero chose to do on the LA Weekly's website on Friday. Romero, who has badly, often inaccurately, and with an obnoxiously condescending anti-pot tone for years, covered the marijuana beat for the LA Weekly. He actually touts the specter of Rover ODing on marijuana in his latest ridiculously embarrassing bit of non-reportage. Romero hangs his execrable piece on the peg of a year-old study from the Journal of Veterinary Emergency and Critical Care that supposedly found a 4-fold increase in the number of dogs that had to be treated for cannabis exposure from 2005 to 2010. But you see, there are problems with Romero's assumptions here. Chiefly among them is the assertion that any dog had to be treated for cannabis exposure, since, simply put, marijuana doesn't hurt dogs. Dogs and all other mammals share the same cannabinoid receptors as human beings. Unlike as with opiates, for example, none of those cannabis receptors are located on areas of the brain that have anything to do with breathing. This is what makes a marijuana overdose, quote unquote, impossible for either humans, dogs, cats, or any other mammal. It has not happened. It will never happen. Marijuana doesn't kill pets in any amount. It is non-toxic. To kill a dog with marijuana, you would have to drop a bale of it on him. There is no fatal dose with cannabis among mammals. Now, past testing on dogs and cats for human clinical trials has revealed that pets have the same cannabinoid receptors as humans and can therefore benefit in the same ways from marijuana. Marinol, a synthetic form of THC, is in fact already used in veterinary oncology as an appetite stimulant. There's another big problem with Romero's breathless reportage. He really does write like a pot virgin. Of the fourfold increase in dogs that had to be treated for cannabis exposure. And that is, of course, veterinarians are all too happy to take a look at your stone pet, cluck around a bit in a professional way, and send you home with a $200 office visit bill. The fact that this entire exercise is completely unnecessary and to boot ridiculous and expensive doesn't make your money any less green to that animal doctor. The trend we've seen in recent years involving pets and marijuana is significant. Romero quotes Anna Brutlog, Assistant Director of Veterinary Services at Pet Poison Helpline, as saying, "Of all illicit drugs, marijuana has always been responsible for the most calls to Pet Poison Helpline, but this recent increase is the sharpest we have ever seen." Of course, missing in all that alarmist talk is the fact that none of these pets were harmed, only perhaps a little sleepy or disoriented, and that all those calls were by owners panicking over the fact that little Fluffy was stoned to the bone. On a regular basis, inaccurate reports of marijuana being poisonous to cats or dogs appear in the mainstream media. Such reports are nonsense. Once again, cannabis is fundamentally non-toxic to all mammals. Romero takes it well into the realm of fiction with these lines. And we can't emphasize this enough, I quote, "Stop blowing smoke into your pooch's snout. It's cute, but in extreme cases, the Pet Poison Helpline experts say, marijuana can kill your dog." No, it can't, Dennis. Pot can't kill your dog. Get a clue, please. Finally, we have an interesting survey from the United States this week that shows marijuana use rising among two sectors of the population, young adults and those in their 50s. Marijuana's rising popularity is behind an increase in pot use behind these two groups, according to the experts. Cannabis is the most popular illegal substance in America, and it only increased its popularity from 2007 to 2012, according to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. More than a fifth of young adults reported they had used quote-unquote illicit drugs in the previous month, with almost 19% of adults 18 to 25 saying they had recently used marijuana. The surge of marijuana use was especially strong among baby boomers in their late 50s, whose rates of illicit drug use rose from 1.9% in 2002 to 6.6% in 2012. According to the researchers, the boomers are taking their lifelong propensity for drugs into that age group. A majority of respondents told the Pew Research Center in another poll earlier this year that marijuana should be legal. Though cannabis use is on the rise, many other drugs have fallen in popularity or remained about the same. Cocaine was less common in 2012 than in 2006, with only 1% of Americans saying they've used it in the past month. Fewer than 640,000 people said they had started using cocaine in the past year, compared with 1 million new users in 2002. Use of methamphetamine fell slightly, while hallucinogens were used at about the same rate as a decade earlier, according to the study. There was also very little change in Americans using psychotherapeutic pharmaceuticals for reasons other than those for which they are prescribed. Underage alcohol use fell between 2002 and 2012. Last year, less than a quarter of underage respondents said they drank alcohol in the past month, compared with 28.8% of underage people a decade earlier. Tobacco use has also fallen among teenagers, but a separate survey recently showed electronic cigarettes are increasingly popular with teens. This annual survey includes about 70,000 teens and adults, and it's sponsored by the Federal Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We have a couple of stories on tokesignals.com that are must-reads this week. You don't want to miss Ron Marksick's new worth repeating, called The New Cannabis-Based Economy. And Mr. Marksick tells us that marijuana legalization for personal use is just the start. We also have medical marijuana research, we have hemp farming, and we have in the future a return to a hemp-based economy that will play a vital part in reversing man-made environmental disasters. So you want to be sure to take a look at The New Cannabis-Based Economy on tokesignals.com. Another one you want to take a look at is eating disorders tied to absence of cannabinoids. And this looks at an intriguing study from 2011. A lot of us know that marijuana, when used medicinally or recreationally, influences the appetite. In other words, it gives you the munchies. This scientific study suggests that deficits in the body's own naturally occurring endocannabinoids, the body's own substances like those found in marijuana, may contribute to anorexia nervosa and bulimia. That's a fascinating study, and you can read about that on tokesignals.com. If you see a pretty flower of cannabis this week, send me the picture. Let's make that bud famous. Give it the exposure it deserves. And I hope you will choose to join me again next week for the 9th episode of tokesignals.com. Until that time, my advice to you is to stay lifted. I'll see you then.